I've lived in New York for my entire life, and when I was younger, I used to watch a lot of television. And I'd watch these programs with these girls, and I became fascinated by one thing. And it was this girl who was eating these bags of chips. And I'd later learned that these chips were pirate booty. And about a week later, I went to my friend's house, and her mom gave us the same bag of chips for snack. And I was just so enamored by that I went home to my mom and I told her, "Mom, I want these chips for snack every single day when I came home from school." And she kind of wrinkled her nose and she was like, "What about the Indian snacks I make for you every day?" And I'm like, "No, can you please get me these?" And she did it because that's what moms do. And every single day I had a bag of chips waiting for me when I came home from school. So like I said, I grew up in New York City, and I was always surrounded by a lot of white people. And that's how I grew up, and it obviously influenced how I did things. When my white friends came over, I'd tell my mom and my dad, never speak in Hindi. That was the one rule. And I'd always have these board games stacked up in a pile, and I'd have the food that my friends were going to eat lined up and ready to go. And everyone had to act a certain way and smile. But when my Indian friends came over, it was more rough and messy, and it wasn't perfect. But I didn't want that. I wanted to be like the girls in school with their chips, and I wanted to be like the girl in the TV show. I didn't want rough-edged and messy. One day, my mom came home and she told us we were going to India for 2 weeks. And I'd been to India before, but it'd been a couple years since I've been. And my first thought when she told me was, ugh, I do not want to go to India. I do not want to be in the heat. I want to be here, and I want to spend the time with my friends when I don't have school. But I still packed my bags and I went. And my favorite part about going to India is the flight, because it's a long flight and it's so chaotic. People are yelling from the back row about some food that their relative has in the front row, and then they have to squeeze through the aisles and then pass it to them, and it's all these hugs and greetings. And when you land in the airport, it's like everyone's speaking in Hindi, and there are immigration flyers, and there's baggage claim, and it's just this type of freeness that I'd never experienced anywhere else. And my grandmother was waiting outside in the car, and she came and she enveloped my brother and I in a tight hug, and she said goodbye to my brother, my mom, and my dad, because I was going to be spending some time in her apartment and living with her. And I remember pulling up to her apartment, and it was this yellow brick apartment, and it had 7 little flats, and each flat had a balcony, and it was really beautiful and small. And as I lived there with her, the neighbors were a big part of her daily life, and it felt so different from my life in New York. And the only time we spoke to our neighbors was when my brother threw the basketball in their area, and then they came over and they handed it back. The only time we ever spoke. So I was living in the apartment. I was surrounded by my mom's violet walls when she was growing up. I was showering in her shower, and she didn't have a shower head, so I had this bucket, and I'd pour it over myself, and I was eating food, and my days consisted of walking in the markets and watching my mother bargain for an item. She'd spend 20 minutes bargaining over probably $1, and it didn't even become of whether or not the dollar was worth it or the item was worth it. It was just about who won the fight, who was the better bargainer. And every time we went to a new store, I was just hoping she'd fight a little harder and win that fight. And we'd ride in rickshaws, and my hand would stick out the car window, and I'd feel the dust in between my fingers. And I remember one time my brother, my grandmother, and I were leaving the apartment complex, and I was sitting in the front. That was so cool because I never got to do that in New York. And a bunch of boys were picking some mangoes at a tree nearby. And they walked over to us, and one of the boys, my grandmother asked, "How much for a bundle of mangoes?" And the boy said some absurd number, and my grandmother was like, "What are you gonna do with all that money?" And I think he said something really sketchy, because all of a sudden, my grandma takes her hand and slaps the boy across the face. And that boy is looking at me, rolling his eyes, and I'm like, why isn't he freaking out? And I've seen the boy around our complex before, helping my grandma carry up groceries up the stairs because they didn't have an elevator, and she'd given him food before when she had leftovers. And she didn't have to look out for him because she was his mother. She was there because she wanted to be there, because there was a sense of community, this sense of togetherness in India, something I never experienced in America. So he just rolled his eyes and he said, "Auntie, you know, this is what teenagers do." And she laughed it off, but like in that kind of way, she's like, "We're gonna talk about this later." And we flash forward, and I'm back in New York, and I'm hanging out with my Indian friends a little bit more, and one day we all go to a restaurant with our moms. And we walk into the restaurant, and we're loud, and we're happy, and we're boisterous, and we're sitting down, and we're about to order our food, when all of a sudden this man stands up, and he bangs his fists on the table, and he says, "If you want to act uncivilized and loud like that, go back to your own country." And I remember the entire restaurant being completely silent, and this fork I had was digging into the palm of my hand, and I was sweating, and my heart was slowing down. And I watch as my mom stands up, and she walks over to that man, and she says, "Sir, we have as much of a right to be in this country as you. This country is as much our home as it is yours." And I never felt more proud to be Indian in that moment than I have in my entire life. And I looked around me and I saw my friends and their mothers nodding their heads, cheering her on. And in my head, I was like, "Yeah, Mom, you tell him." And it was this sense of, again, togetherness and community, and something I never experienced before. I knew people were there for me and they had my back in a way that I'd never had before. So it's not like I went back to school and I was all of a sudden, you know, this Indian girl who like ate Indian food at lunch and listened to Indian music and wore Indian clothes and spoke in Hindi. But I began to realize that I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't. And I began picking up pieces of myself that I'd let fall.
All right, thank you, Saya. Let's keep it going for Saya.